Hello and a very warm welcome indeed to the first edition of Quadriga in 2019. And as the new year gets underway, Germany has, alongside 4 other countries, become a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Now, there are high expectations about what Germany can achieve, but Berlin's 2-year stint on the Council comes at a very difficult time, with the devastating and ongoing conflicts in both Syria and in Ukraine. The UN is also gravely divided, chronically underfunded and mired in inefficiency. Not to mention the aggressive challenge posed by US President Donald Trump to the rules-based international order on which the UN is built. So our question here on Quadriga this week is, Germany joins the Security Council, but is the UN broken? And to discuss that question, I'm joined here in the studio by 3 astute observers and analysts, beginning with Gunter Pleuger, who was Germany's ambassador to the UN between 2002 and 2006. He says an increasingly interdependent world, we need the UN as the only organisation that can find global solutions and set new international law. Also with us is Christoph von Marschall, chief diplomatic correspondent for the Berlin-based daily Der Tagesspiegel, who argues that being nice is not enough. Germany must show that it can exercise pressure to achieve its goals. And a very warm welcome too to Andrea Shalal, senior correspondent with the Reuters news agency. Andrea believes that the United Nations has long-standing institutional problems that have been magnified by Donald Trump's America First policies, but she maintains it will survive. Well, thank you, all 3, for being here today on Quadriga. I'd like to begin with you, Ambassador Pleuger, who you've served at the United Nations for 4 years, a couple of years ago. Just tell us what the mood is like at the United Nations at the moment. It seems that it's the worst that it's been for a long time.
Well, I think the United Nations has always struggled with certain inefficiencies that emanate from its structure. But it is certainly, it has been successful in many cases. Just to give you one example, I remember when in 2004 the violence broke out again in Haiti. On a Sunday morning, the president of the Security Council called the members and said, we will have a meeting at 4 o'clock this afternoon. By 7 o'clock, we had taken all the necessary decisions. And by 10 o'clock that day, 2 airplanes with French and American soldiers were airborne on their way to Haiti. So that's possible too. But on the other hand, right now, of course, the UN is in a particularly difficult position because not only because of Trump's policy, but because we are troubled in practically all corners of the world. And the UN can solve these problems only with the cooperation of the member states. And without the member states' cooperation, the UN is powerless.
Let me just come in on the challenge to the United Nations, if you so will, posed by the US President Donald Trump. Andrea, when he was still president-elect in 2006, he said, when do you see the United Nations solving problems? They don't, they cause problems. Do you agree?
You know, I think the United Nations has a problem in that it isn't properly represented. I mean, most of the countries of the world don't. You know, we only have 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So there's been a lot of calls for that structure to be revamped to increase the representation. If you have a body that purports to speak for the whole world, but there are many countries that are not represented, that creates these kind of imbalances that we see. And I think the UN, I would say, is trying to solve problems, but often unintentionally.
And you say Donald Trump magnifies the problems that are manifested at the United Nations. How does he magnify the problems? Well,
the funding for operations is very heavily weighted to the United States. When the United States pulls out its funding of programs like the UNDP or the UNRWA organization, what happens is that those imbalances become much more evident. So he's sort of, he's basically the, unilateral actions that the United Nations is taking and the rejection of the UN structures are in fact kind of, revealing these problems that have been there all along.
Christoph von Marschall, you are one of those who say that the United Nations is a good idea in principle, but the reality is something completely different. Tell us about that troubling reality.
Well, the United Nations can't be more democratic and more rules-based than its member states are. And the majority of member states are dictatorships or at least authoritarian regimes. The democracies and the states of law are in the minority. And that, of course, limits the possibilities of the United Nations to be what they are supposed to be, which is somehow the guarantor of a rules-based world order. And this is a special challenge to Germany. Germany is used to put the main point on diplomatics, on diplomatic solutions, and also being nice and talking people into solutions. And if we have partners which just don't agree on that and say, well, if we block a certain solution, it's much better for us, then Germany is not up to the task. And that's, I think, what Germany has to do now. It has to show that it's not only able to be nice, but also to apply pressure. It's the fourth biggest economic country, power of the world. So we have a lot of pressure. Even without taking military action, we can put pressure on member states, and we should do that. And unfortunately, the first, what the federal government said until now, how they see their role in the Security Council, doesn't point into that direction. It's more of being nice again.
What needs to change?
Well, our foreign minister, for example, Heiko Maas, said he wants to put the focus on climate change, on the role of women in conflicts, and on diplomatic preemption of conflicts. That is all nice and fair, but it's not enough. I mean, the real big problems are, how do we deal with the Ukrainian war or crisis? How do we deal with China's behavior in the Chinese seas, putting pressure? How do we deal with huge humanitarian crisis and civil unrest in Yemen, in Sudan, wherever you look? And that you can't just solve by talking nicely and trying to persuade the ill-doers to behave a little bit better. You have to put pressure on those regimes, and you have to stand up against China and Russia in a certain way. And I don't see that willingness until now in the German diplomacy.
Are you skeptical?
To follow up that, we have to make sure that the Charter is being recognized, and we do speak out if things are going wrong. For example, remember the Iran agreement. That was an agreement worked out by 5 member states, and it was adopted by the Security Council by a unanimous vote. So at that time, it became international law because a decision of the Security Council under Article 25 of the Charter is binding on all member states. Mm-hmm. That means it has become international law. Now, you can withdraw from a treaty, but you cannot withdraw from international law. And we have to make this sure that it is known all over and also in the Security Council. Okay. I've never heard about this.
Point taken. Andrea?
Well, I was just going to say, Germany keeps saying it wants to play a bigger role in the world. And, there's deep skepticism about whether it will ever make that promise true, because it keeps saying these things. Since 2014, at the Munich Security Conference, we've heard the same mantra over and over again. We're hearing it now from Heiko Maas. And the question is, how exactly does Germany plan to do that? And so I was just, struck. The skepticism is present, not just internationally, but here in Germany as well. And what has to probably happen is that there has to be a tidal shift in terms of education of the German public. Because one of the biggest barriers to Germany, being more powerful is that it doesn't carry a big stick. So it has economic might, but it won't engage in military action. That it won't do that because of massive political resistance in Germany. But the times are changing.
OK, we'll talk about that point in just a minute. But first of all, Christoph von Marschall, to what extent is the veto power of the P5 at the heart of many of the problems that face the United Nations and the Security Council?
Yeah, of course, that is a very powerful measure which they can take. And of course, I wouldn't say when I advocated for Germany putting pressure also on China or on Russia, that wouldn't mean that we can overcome the veto of China or of Russia, but we can let them feel the consequences for the time being. Russia, for example, just made it impossible to talk about the Ukrainian crisis in the Security Council and in the UN. Should we agree to that? Should we just let it happen, say, oh, well, we can't do anything about it? We could also tell them, you know, we have a lot of economic possibilities what to do with you. If you don't agree that at least we can discuss these problems with you. And these steps should be taken. I also have no illusion that China will change its behavior in the seas or when it comes to trade politics or whatever. But we can let them pay a certain price if they misbehave. And this willingness has to emerge. So it's not only about the military stick, it's also about using our economic power, the economic power stick. And for the time being in Germany, the normal reaction is, oh, you know, we don't want to let that business go. It's much better to play nice with China or to have our energy contracts with Russia. And we never seriously talk about that we could change this kind of politics.
OK, let's stay on the veto, because the last year saw the greatest number of vetoes in the Security Council since 1989, mostly over Syria. The impact, as we see now, has been tragic.
The images shocked the world. Victims of an alleged chemical attack on Douma near Damascus, many of them children. And the international community? Frozen. Moscow used its veto power in the UN Security Council to defend Assad's regime against Western interests. Sanctions, investigations, ceasefire agreements, all blocked. In the Russian-Ukrainian dispute over the status of the Crimean Peninsula as well, the UN could offer little more than symbolic support. As feared, Russia and the US stopped any productive resolution from getting underway. The US has also made active use of its vetoing privileges. Towards the end of 2017, it blocked a resolution criticising Trump's decision to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now the American embassy is moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. What good is a Security Council with vetoing power?
Ambassador Pleuger, is the Security Council being reduced to a blocking shop?
To a certain extent, yes, because of the vetoes of the 5 members who have a right of veto, and whenever their interests are involved, you know, they tend to block a decision. But on the other hand, I think we should not discuss whether we could abolish the veto, because that's not possible. Because the veto cannot be removed unless you have a change of the Charter. And a change of the Charter needs a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly.
But that means that the Security Council is frozen in time. It's frozen, go right back to the end of the Second World War, yes. And we're stuck there forever and a day.
Yes. The problem is that a change of the Charter, removing the veto, would require the consent of the P5. That's put in the Charter. So it's in vain to discuss whether we could abolish the veto. But what we can do, and there I agree with Christoph Marschall, we can put pressure. And by good arguments, you mentioned already the case of Ukraine. I mean, the situation there is that the 2 agreements that have been worked out in Minsk have been made international law by a unanimous decision of the Security Council. Now, why not send a UN mission, including the P5 and representatives of the P5, to Ukraine, to the Ukraine as a whole, not just to the Western Ukraine? And if we, for example, would suggest that, the Russians might veto that. But if they do that, they would prevent the implementation of their own decisions in the Security Council and thereby lose a lot of credibility. So this is a kind of thing how we could put pressure on the Security Council to take a reasonable position.
Andrea Shalal, what perspective do you see from broadening the representative nature of the Security Council?
Well, I think that there is a possibility of some kind of a reset. We have, any time that there's a change in the structure of the Security Council, you have an opportunity for new conversations. We have a U.S. president that is going to be increasingly limited by the Democratic majority in the House. He's facing a lot of pressure at home. China is facing economic pressure. Russia is facing economic pressure. The pressures on those permanent Security Council members are increasing outside of even what can be done diplomatically, just economically. And that will create a different environment that creates opportunities. And I agree, I think Germany could play a really good and positive and constructive role if it stands up and really speaks with one voice. Germany's had a very dysfunctional couple of years. Elections, governments, infighting, perhaps too that will change now with new leadership at the CDU level.
I'm a little bit skeptical because it's not only a question of the political leadership, it's also a question of the public debate in Germany. And at the moment, still, this public debate is very much dominated by all these happy talking ideas about pacifism, about playing nice. And we don't have a real open debate that the world is a dangerous place, that you should have, that you have national interest, that you should also admit that you have national interest, and that every country is fighting for its national interest, and we should do so. And we should also have no illusions about European unity. In some cases, we have European unity, in others not. So we have to play in this playbox, and we have to analyze very thoroughly where we can achieve alliances and where we can't, and then we have to go for it. And we shouldn't also not be afraid to talk about the dysfunctionality of the United Nations, where it is dysfunctional, and not being afraid that that somehow destroys the whole idea. In Germany, we have a too idealistic picture of the United Nations, as if this would be the world government and the representation of a rule of law all over the world. And then we have had instances like Libya being at the head of the Human Rights Council. And we had Tehran being at the head of the Women's Rights Council. And North Korea was even at the head of the Denuclearization Council. These are examples where you see it's absolutely ridiculous, but it's sometimes ridiculous, and that we should admit. And on the other hand, we should try to use the United Nations where it can be constructive, and we have to do something in order to make it more constructive.
I think we have a good chance to do this in the coming 2 years in the Security Council, because, as you know, we will soon have a Élysée Treaty #2 with France. And that means that we can join our hands with France in the Security Council and in the UN in general to push things ahead. And I can say from my own experience, when I was ambassador to the United Nations in 2003 in the Security Council, the then French ambassador and myself, we made a promise to go together in every case. Nobody would go without the other, nobody would do anything against the other, and we would always take joint action. And that has, of course, a certain effect, because it makes it easier to get a majority of 9 votes in the Security Council to come to a decision. And it is also then, together with France, easier to get a blocking minority of 7 votes, so that the other side cannot get the 9 votes necessary for a decision. So I think there is a good chance that in these 2 years we will make our influence felt together with France.
OK, thank you for those optimistic observations. The UN currently has 14 peacekeeping operations in crisis regions. Mostly it's about maintaining a tenuous peace between 2 or more conflict parties. Here are just 2 examples of the challenges that the Blue Helmets face.
Half the UN peacekeeping missions are in Africa. One is in Mali. 15,000 UN soldiers and civilian workers, including several German aides, are there to support the 2013 peace agreement between the government and Tuareg rebels. Since then, war hasn't officially broken out, but violence hasn't ended. terrorist attacks still occur. The UN mission to Mali, MINUSMA, is one of the most deadly. So far, over 100 UN personnel have been killed. The UN observer mission Undorf near the Golan Heights was long considered a quiet job. That is until the Syrian civil war erupted. Suddenly, the buffer zone between Israel and Syria was swarming with rebels, terrorists and the Syrian army. The UN had to retreat. Now, Israel has raised concerns that Iranian troops could encroach upon their defence line. Are the Blue Helmets fighting a losing battle?
Shalal, a losing battle. How good is the UN at peacekeeping?
Well, you know, it has some successes, and I think that you could argue that without the UN peacekeeping efforts, there would be more violence. So even if it doesn't necessarily lead to peace, it prevents further outbreaks of violence, and the situation in Mali could be a whole lot worse. For that matter, so is this, the situation throughout the Middle East. Without the presence of the UN peacekeepers, and I think they can play a constructive role. It's not a panacea. It's not a Band-Aid.
When you talk about Mali and we talk about Germany's role in general at the United Nations and in peacekeeping missions, I'm interested to come back to the point that both of you mentioned, that the legacy of Germany from the Second World War, that it is still largely a country that has a pacifist streak, very sort of central to German society and German politics. Is Germany going to have to overcome that pacifist streak? Is Germany going to have to shed that legacy?
Yeah, it has to overcome it. It doesn't have to shed the legacy in the sense that we shouldn't think about it and keep it in mind. Of course, we should keep it in mind. It's a responsibility, but it's not a responsibility not to act. It's a responsibility to act in order to find solutions. And such cases like in Mali is that even the German peacekeeping troops have only very limited functions, that they don't want to do anything which is connected with the risk that the other one has to do. That is not the right solution. But I have my doubts that this whole German society is really so peaceful, as it's often said. That is a belief in the political class, that this is a barrier you can't overcome. If you're talking to German citizens all over the country, and I'm doing that quite often, they are very realistic and they understand it. Of course, it's not a role they are looking for to have more trouble for German peacekeepers, but they understand that we can't play this special role where different rules apply to the Germans than to all other nations. And that is just an excuse to have a more, not so difficult job as this international concert.
Well, I agree that there is a certain difficulty in German public opinion on how Germany should engage in military action abroad. But I think if it comes to peacekeeping operations, this has nothing to do with enlarging the German influence in some other parts of the world. It is, I think, a measure to bring more peace and to bring more justice to certain areas in the world where otherwise it can't be done. And last point, the United Nations, that is often criticized as being inefficient, can only act if the member states are willing to make their contribution. Without that, nothing will work. And therefore, I think it is absolutely necessary that a big country like Germany, that is the second largest donor of resources for human environment, for development, etc., in the international context, and the fourth largest contributor to the cost of the United Nations, that we should engage, if necessary, also in military action to secure peace or to re-establish peace and security in other countries.
OK, we're running out of time slowly but surely, and I'd like to get from each of you a proposal for the best way to move forward at the United Nations, a package of reform for the United Nations that Germany could push. Christoph and Marschall.
Yeah, not an unrealistic wish list, so we don't talk about reforming the Security Council, but what Germany could do is trying to be more active in building alliances of countries which subscribe to the multilateral order and which are willing,
multilateralist alliance,
and would also give more support and financial support and political support to the United Nations solutions.
Andrea Shalal.
I agree.
Your reform proposal.
I agree. I think you leverage those areas where there are common interests, whether it's climate change, whether it's opposition to President Trump, whether it's, anywhere you can get common interests together, leverage that to get those blocking minorities and to get those votes together to move for change and, be more brazen.
Ambassador Pleuger.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems for decision-making in the Security Council is the P5 veto. Now, we know that the veto cannot be removed, but we could perhaps do something that makes it easier to take the necessary decision in the Security Council. And I think we should try to convince people in the United Nations and the P5 not to use the veto in cases of gross violation of human rights. And second,
Very quickly, please.
And second, to justify a veto in the General Assembly if it is taken.
Okay, we've got to leave it there. Thank you for joining us on Quadriga. Just for this week. Sorry.